The battle at Antietam is also known as the Battle of Sharpsburg and took place on September 17th in 1862. It's the single bloodiest day of warfare on United States soil. The story of the Battle of Antietam often is told in terms of the colossal military engagement and the tragic loss of life and the stalemate. It really ended as a stalemate. Neither side won a decisive victory, but General Lee did withdraw back into Virginia after that battle. Some people are aware from pictures and images that what's called the Dunker Church was basically in the center of the battlefield, at least for the morning part, and the Confederate forces were massed around it. Union forces advanced against them and used the white walls of the Brethren congregation's meeting house as a kind of target site for shooting toward the Confederates. And then some people are familiar with the church in the photos that were taken by Matthew Brady's studio after the battle, where there are many images of dead soldiers in front of the church, some dead animals, and there's also there are some images that show damage from cannonballs to the church building.
Oh, the Jesus way, is the way of peace. Oh, the Jesus way, is the way of peace. Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When He is King, all wars will cease. May His peace begin with me.
The Civil War Battle of Antietam was fought on just one day. September 17, 1862. It's described by historians as the bloodiest battle in this country's history. One of the most noted landmarks on that field of combat is the Dunker Church. And a visit to the Dunker Church today is like a step back in time. Hello, I'm Brent Carlson. Welcome to Brethren Voices. We took our cameras to the National Park of the Antietam Battlefield in Sharpsburg, Maryland, to visit the Dunker Church. And at this past year's annual conference of the Church of the Brethren in Cincinnati, Ohio, we visited with Jeff Bach of the Young Center to learn more about this congregation. Jeff Bach, thank you for visiting with us on Brethren Voices today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Jeff, you actually have a couple of roles, one of which is the director of the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies.
Yes, correct.
And you also have a position at Elizabethtown College.
Correct.
Can you just explain a little bit about what your role in both of those is?
The Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies is a part of Elizabethtown College.
Oh, really? I didn't know
Yes.
that.
And I'm the director there, so I oversee programming and also teach, and I do some writing. And my teaching is for Elizabethtown College's Department of Religious Studies. So I teach courses related to Anabaptist and Pietist groups.
So those two roles merge pretty well.
Yes, yes, it's very good.
Well, today we wanted to talk about Antietam.
Yes.
And there's a new book about Antietam. And most people know about Gettysburg. Can you tell us about Antietam and how they relate? And the Church of the Brethren actually has had churches in both areas. Just kind of maybe give us a quick overview of how those chronologically took place and physically, how they are portioned in the geography of Pennsylvania.
The church at the Antietam Battlefield has been known as Mumah's Meeting House, named for the family that donated the land, Samuel Mumah Sr. It was an offshoot of the Manor Church, the Brethren congregation, German Baptist Brethren as they were known at the time. And the Mumah daughter congregation was beginning around 1851 They built their meeting house in 1853.
160 years ago,
Yes,
roughly?
right. And it's near the town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, just south of Hagerstown, Maryland. And it was an area that was settled by German immigrants mostly from Pennsylvania, who'd already had a generation or so of families in Pennsylvania and were moving south into Maryland. And some of them were Brethren, others were German Reformed, and others were Lutheran. And the Mumam Meeting House congregation was comprised of a handful of families that were meeting there. They worshiped sometimes at Manor Church, which was about 7 miles away. But in the 1850s, they decided they would like their own meeting house. Gettysburg is located farther north in Pennsylvania, and Gettysburg was settled that area also early in the 1700s, and also a mix of predominantly Lutheran, but also some Reformed and some Brethren families that moved into that area also. The battle at Antietam is also known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, and took place on September 17th in 1862. It's the single bloodiest day of warfare on United States soil. Ever. The Battle of Gettysburg took place a year later, July 2 through 4 in 1863. And there were many, many casualties there, but it was spread over 3 days of fighting. The Mumam Meeting House was really in the center of the battle at Sharpsburg or Antietam, typically called Antietam, and so it had a much more prominent role. The Marsh Creek Meeting House near Gettysburg and near the battlefield was close by, but it wasn't involved in the fighting at Gettysburg. But there were Brethren families at Gettysburg. And the geographical location is very similar, somewhat rolling land. The soil is rocky underneath, but still good farmland. At Antietam, at Sharpsburg, the Antietam Creek flows through the area where the Brethren farms were, and then into the Potomac River, which curves close by there. And the battle at Antietam took place because General Lee's desire was to invade into the north, thinking it could persuade the citizens of Maryland to join the Confederacy. And by accident, actually, federal troops found a copy of Lee's battle plans and then marched toward him. And the place where they met, almost just by the accident of geography, was on the Brethren farms just outside of Sharpsburg, with the Mumam Meeting House, the Brethren Meeting House, basically in the center of the first half of the fighting that day.
Was there anybody in the meeting house? Or
No.
if there were, they didn't stay long.
Right. Most people had evacuated the farms a day or so before the actual battle. The Brethren had worship on the Sunday before the battle, which occurred on a Tuesday. And Elder David Long from Manor congregation preached that day, probably on text from the Psalms. But they already knew that trouble was coming. The precursor to the Battle of Antietam was the battle at South Mountain, just a couple of miles away. And they could hear on Sunday afternoon the roar of cannon and could see the smoke rising from the woods and fields at South Mountain. And then Confederate soldiers, the Confederate forces were closest, came and warned the families that they should evacuate because the soldiers would probably meet and engage in that area. So most of the families evacuated on Monday and went up to the Manor Church to shelter there until everything was over.
Is there a reason it was the bloodiest battle on American soil?
So a large part of the Army of Northern Virginia and a couple of Union units were both in the area, and when the Union Army became aware that the Confederates were pushing an advance into Maryland, The Union Army marched toward the Confederate forces, hoping to defeat them and push them back into Virginia.
To keep them from advancing any more north.
Correct. And so there were large numbers of armies there. Both sides called in reinforcements, and both sides were determined to get their goal. The Union wanted to force the Confederates back into Virginia. The Confederates hoped to defeat the Union forces so that they could make their advance into Maryland. And so it was a very fierce battle. Both sides wanted to win, and the generals and commanding officers kept pushing their units harder in attack against each other. And so there was a lot of shooting and a lot of killing that day. The other battles of the Civil War were bloody as well, but usually they were fought over multiple days, not just one day like Antietam
You could
was.
advance and withdraw.
Right.
But in this one, neither side wanted to give any ground.
Correct.
Because it was very important to advance, so to speak.
Right.
Or to push the other back.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Do you know how many people died?
From roughly 9 a.m. to about noon, 27,000 were wounded or killed on both sides. And then the fighting continued till late afternoon.
And then with that kind of fighting, there was nowhere to go if you were wounded, and nobody to pull you out of the...
The armies of both sides tried to set up field hospitals as best they could. So they used barns and farm buildings around, and actually the Mumma Meeting House was used as a first aid station for the Confederacy. The Confederate Army one of their strong points was around the Mumma Meeting House and in the woods beside it. And so as their soldiers were wounded and people were able to bring them back toward the meeting house, they were cared for there. And later in the day, Army surgeons for the Confederacy were amputating limbs to try to save lives. One of the witnesses from that day reported seeing amputated arms and legs stacked as high as the bottom sill of the window outside the church building. And Samuel Mumma, who was a member and donated the land, worked with the team to carry away the severed limbs and bury them in the days after the battle.
I'm surprised anybody survived in that.
Yes, it's quite amazing that there were survivors.
And that's pretty brutal. Medical care was pretty simple and pretty brutal.
It was brutal at the time. Clara Barton set up a field hospital for the Union, part of the work that would eventually lead to the Red Cross. And her hospitals were stationed on the north end of the battlefield. And the Dunker, or the Brethren Meeting House, was used by the Confederacy.
Well, tell us about the book, September Morn.
This is a new book about the Brethren Meeting House at Antietam, September Morn, written by Alan Schmidt, who was a guide at the Antietam National Battlefield for many years, and also by Terry Barkley, who's a historian and archivist in the Church of the Brethren.
I remember, I've met Terry.
And they have done extensive research on the battle, the church building, the events that happened around the church, and they've just released this book that details those experiences and gives a better picture of the Brethren congregation and how the battle affected the Brethren and the role that the Brethren Meeting House had that day.
There's so much to learn about the history of the Brethren and Antietam and all of those things in the Civil War. Are some things that some people know about, but most people don't. Because I think there's Civil War buffs that have really engaged in learning and actually visited the sites. But for most of us, I don't think we even know that the Church of the Brethren was involved in or close by or doing anything during the Civil War.
So the story of the Battle of Antietam often is told in terms of the colossal military engagement and the tragic loss of life and the stalemate. It really ended as a stalemate. Neither side won a decisive victory, but General Lee did withdraw back into Virginia after that battle. Some people are aware from pictures and images that what's called the Dunker Church was basically in the center of the battlefield, at least for the morning part, and the Confederate forces were massed around it. Union forces advanced against them and used the white walls of the Brethren congregation's meeting house as a kind of target site for shooting toward the Confederates. And then some people are familiar with the church in the photos that were taken by Matthew Brady after the battle, but I think people don't know very much about the congregation there. It was a small congregation. Samuel Mumma married a Brethren woman, and he did not adopt the fully plain ways of the church. So there's a wonderful photograph of him with long side whiskers, sideburns, and in a very fancy suit next to his wife in a rather plain looking dress and a white bonnet. And but he was a member by this time and supportive. Another little known story from Antietam is that some of the families owned slaves. This is really difficult because the Brethren forbade slavery and disciplined members who had slaves. Elder Daniel Long, Elder David Long at Manor Church sometimes purchased slaves in order to free them. Samuel Mumma had 2 slaves that he had purchased, and in 1856 he freed both of them, but they were still living on his property after 1856. One of the slaves was a young boy, and in Maryland a freed slave could not leave the property until he was 18, and that young boy was not quite 18.
That was probably for their own protection.
Well, thought to be for their own protection, but the farmer, whatever farmer owned them, could still profit from their labor, even though they were manumitted. Yeah. But it seems that Samuel Mumma probably purchased these slaves with the intent to manumit them, since he did free them in 1856 already. Another family that's more curious is the family of John Otto. He had purchased 2 slaves, a mother and her son. The mother's name was Aunt Nancy, that's how she was known. Her son was Hilary Watson, and he was an adult by the time of the Civil War. And then in 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, John Otto freed both of those slaves. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation did not have any effect in Maryland because the state did not secede. And so Maryland, even though it was in the Union, still had slaves, but the Emancipation Proclamation had no effect in 1863 to free them. But John Otto did free these 2 slaves, and within the same year, Hilary Watson, the man, was drafted to fight in the Union Army. John Otto asked him if he wanted to fight, and Hilary Watson said no, and so John Otto went to Frederick and paid the $300 fee for exemption so that Hilary didn't have to fight in the war.
Wow.
And John did pay Hilary and his mother after 1863, but they technically were not freed until the state of Maryland issued its own Emancipation Proclamation after the war ended.
In listening to you, I heard something I didn't know, or if I heard it right, that the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the southern states?
Yes, only to the states that seceded from the Union.
And of course so Lincoln is doing that, and they're saying we're not listening to you and we're not abiding by it.
Correct.
Because you're not our president.
Correct. So the Emancipation Proclamation basically had no effect in the states to which it was addressed. The border states, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, all had slaveholding families, but the Emancipation Proclamation had no effect in those states because they didn't secede and join the Confederacy.
That must have inflamed some people on the southern side.
It inflamed people on both sides. There were Northerners who resented it and Southerners who resented it. Yes.
Is the Church of the Brethren still active in the Gettysburg and the Sharpsburg areas?
Yes, in the case of Sharpsburg, after the battle, the church was restored. They had to scrub all of the blood out and repair some of the furniture and the exterior walls. But then the building was blown down by a windstorm in 1921 and completely destroyed. And by this time, the Brethren had built a second meeting house in the town of Sharpsburg itself. And when the church was blown down, a local businessman purchased the scrap material, the bricks, the wood, the furniture, and he kept them in storage. And then in the 1950s, as the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Antietam was approaching, both the National Park Service and the Brethren decided it would be a really good idea to rebuild the church as a part of the battlefield memorial. And so the Brethren collected a lot of money and did work and used a lot of the material that had been saved by this businessman. So the building was rebuilt. There were plenty of photos of it so that they would know what it looked like. There were members whose grandparents had been part of the Muma meeting house who could describe what it was like. And one woman in particular, Ruth Otto, could remember going to the church before it was blown down by a tornado or by the windstorm. She was not there at the time of the battle, but she remembered it from her childhood before it was destroyed. By 1962, in time for the 100th anniversary of the battle, the church was reconstructed, and they had a dedication service on September 2nd, 1962. And it's now an integral part of the interpretation of the battlefield, and guides like Alan Shepard talk about the role of the peace-loving Dunkers in the midst of this bloody day of fighting.
So you can go there and see the church. Can you go in it?
Yes, you can go in, and every year in September, on the Sunday closest to the anniversary of the battle, Brethren from Mid-Atlantic and other places gather and hold a worship service in memory of the battle. It's a Brethren-style worship service, and there's preaching, and a lot of visitors to the battlefield come and visit the service along with the Brethren who come and participate.
Jeff Bach, thank you for being with us on Brethren Voices.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
You've told us more about Antietam than we knew, and there's a lot more to learn.
Yes. I hope people will read the book.
Yes. We want to graciously thank Jeff Bach for his time and his knowledge and sharing that knowledge with us about the Dunker congregation of Sharpsburg, Maryland. Brethren continue to work for peace and justice, and at times it feels like a battle against great odds on many different fronts. On September 17, 1862, a tremendous amount of lives were lost because of conflicts in beliefs and values. However, for us humans, our biggest battle in modern times may be over our understanding of climate change and the conflict in our values and our beliefs around attempting to save life as we know it on this planet. What I'm about to say is hard for many to hear. Every day, as many or more children in this world die of starvation as died at Antietam. And for them and their parents, it's a daily battle to survive one more day. Desertification is taking away farmland. We thank the following information, which we received from New Community Project. For the past several centuries, we have seen a steady rise in the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere as a result of burning gas, oil, and coal, and from deforestation. While the Earth needs a modest amount of these gases to trap the sun's heat, otherwise we'd be like frozen popsicles, yet too many of these same gases is like wearing too many clothes on a sunny day. Things can heat up real fast, which is exactly what is happening with the Earth's climate, and faster than scientists thought was even possible just a few years ago. It was recently reported that the Earth is already 1 degree Fahrenheit warmer than it was 250 years ago. Now that doesn't sound like much, but the new Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report warns that if we don't keep the global temperatures to less than 2.7 degrees higher than it was way back then, compared to the 3.6 degrees which some scientists say we're headed for, we risk as many as twice as many people vulnerable to extreme heat events, 60 million more people facing water shortages, 10 million people subject to coastal flooding, and of course more severe storm events and wildfires. Corn harvests dropping by half, and the same for the production of our marine fisheries. Insect ranges reduced dramatically, and plant life reduced by over half, as well as the loss of 99% of our coral reefs. And twice as many animals losing half their habitat. So we need to cut our greenhouse emissions by at least half in the next 12 years. What happens when we start fighting over food and water shortages? What can we do? There are actually many things, and here are just a few, from the easiest to the most challenging. Change our eating patterns by gardening and buying locally and going vegetarian as much as possible. Use less and buy less stuff. Reuse and recycle scrupulously. Reduce gasoline-powered car use. And of course, pray for ourselves and others, that we can learn to make the changes we need to make in our lives for the sake of our children and the future. For more information, please check out the website of New Community Project. This is Brent Carlson for Brethren Voices, wishing you peace.
Is the way of peace. Oh, the Jesus way is the way of peace. When He is King, our wars will cease. May His peace begin with me. All those who tread the path He trod, all those who tread the path He trod, all those who tread the path He trod shall be called the friends of God. May His peace begin with